You're listening to Lab Out Loud, science for the classroom and beyond. And today, our guest is Stephen Pompea. He's here to talk about the many benefits that we can gain when scientists support science education in both formal and informal settings.
I think we have a science-interested child. They're not getting anything for a long, long time, and they're not really ever encountering somebody who has that scientific playfulness, self-confidence to say their passion, self-confidence, wants to try the experiment, wants to play around, wants to investigate. They may not get that exposure to that person in their family. They may not get it through their neighbors. They may not get it through school for a long, long time. And I guess that's the question is, if you have a budding scientist, how long can they wait? Is fifth grade too late? Is seventh grade too late? Is 12th grade too late? Well, I think we know the answer to that. The sooner the better.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I am Brian Bartell.
And today's episode speaks right to what I believe is the heart of Lab Out Loud, and that is to build those connections and build those conversations from scientists into science education. And we have a great guest who's helping us with those conversations.
Stephen, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here. My name is Stephen Pompea. I'm here in the Netherlands, in Leiden, as a visiting professor in the Leiden Observatory. I'm also an observatory scientist emeritus at NSF's NOIR Lab. That's the ground-based center for astronomy, and that's in Tucson, Hawaii, and La Serena, Chile. And I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm an adjunct professor at Stewardship Observatory of the University of Arizona and the James C. Wyatt College of Optical Sciences at the University of Arizona.
So you rack up the travel miles, is what you're saying.
Well, I used to live in Tucson, so that has a natural connection with all of those organizations.
Absolutely. So where are you from originally?
I would say Tucson's been my home for many, many years. So I think that's the original. I grew up in Colorado, but I also grew up in Europe and North Africa as my father was in the Air Force. So when we were very young, we traveled around.
Sure, that explains it. You've seen the world.
Well, listeners don't always appreciate this end of the podcast, but it's actually been a few months for Stephen and us to connect, and for a variety of reasons. And so one of those was Dale and I got quite busy with subbing in a little piece of our job there, as many of you have probably experienced sub shortages across the country and beyond. But Stephen's also told us that he has colleagues that have been in Ukraine, and that has hampered some of his efforts there too. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Stephen?
Right. Here in Europe, Ukraine is a trusted partner in many, many different scientific endeavors. And at Leiden Observatory, we have many researchers from Russia and Ukraine. And the Ukraine situation has made it very difficult for the collaborations that are going on in Europe. In our astronomy and society group at Leiden Observatory, they've reached out to all of the members of the International Astronomical Society who are in Ukraine and to try to see what they can do to help the situation or to help them. So there's been a great deal of effort from Europe especially and from the Netherlands to try to connect up with the colleagues and see what we can do to make the situation a little bit better.
That's heartwarming. It kind of reminds me a little bit of stories we heard out of World War II, where the scientific community helped scientists escape Nazi Germany at that time. And, hopefully we're not in that dire of a situation, but it is absolutely a devastating situation for Ukraine. And we forget sometimes the scientific impact that the conflict has brought.
Well, I think it takes a little bit of time to realize that as you hear stories coming out of Ukraine, like all those stories have all those people have a backstory. They're scientists, they're teachers, they're professionals, they're working in all these different areas, and you just don't have that view right away. You just lump all the whole country together at first.
Right. There are many, many stories, and there's many personal connections from people here to people there, and it's even at the level of fundraising for buying tourniquets that can be sent or put in cars that can go to the border and transfer the tourniquets to to somewhere where they can be used in Ukraine. So it's at that level of very basic help in many cases.
How has that impacted science collaboration with Russia in general?
I really can't say much about that. All I can say is that the people from Russia who are working at the universities in the Netherlands are, in general, from what I've heard or have heard from, are very sympathetic to the situation in Ukraine. So it's not a polarization. They feel a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainians and are working hard in the same way I just described.
Mm-hmm. Well, we wanted to talk to you because we found an article that really and it's interesting because we've talked about this at length on the show over the many years that we've done Lab Out Loud, but usually from the other perspective. And so the title of the article is 10 Simple Rules for Scientists Getting Started in Science Education. Now, normally Dale and I talk a lot about science educators connecting with scientists from the other side of that lens there, but it's heartwarming to see this being talked about or discussed from the science framework versus the science education. But there's a lot of parallels, and so can you tell us a little bit about your background with encouraging that cooperation between science or big science and science education?
Right. Well, certainly I have a great deal of interest in science education. I feel very fortunate that I came up through a system that encouraged me in science education. But I always, throughout my career, knew that I wanted to do science education. I wanted to be a teacher, science teacher. I also wanted to be a scientist. I also wanted to be an engineer. So I really wanted to do all of those things in my life, and I found the opportunity to do those and combine them in different ways. So there's a great deal of sympathy and identification with the challenges of science teaching, not only from the past but currently. And I should mention also that my wife has a long career in education. The latter part of her career was in science education as well. So I got a lot of stories from the front lines, so to speak, and that has encouraged me to want to take some action and take some interest in making things a little better.
What was your first teaching experience?
Well, it's kind of hard to say because I was keen on that from an early age, but one of the formative experiences I had was when I was an undergraduate student, and I was hired by the Parent-Teacher Association to go to an inner-city school in Houston to set up a program on the playground to try to attract and interest kids in science. So I would lug equipment that I borrowed from the physics lab, like tuning forks with resonant boxes, and I'd set up things on the playground, and it was a concrete playground, by the way. There was no dirt. It was in kind of an inner city courtyard that looked a little like a prison courtyard. And when the kids got out of school, they would be coming by and looking and asking, well, what are you doing? And they'd be playing with waves or doing experiments with sound. And that was a very formative experience to help me understand how kids could get interested in science, and it was actually just a person from that Parent-Teacher Association decided that they wanted to do something, and they did by looking for a student to hire, and I was that student.
Brian and I both have similar experiences. When I was an undergrad, I worked for our university had a science outreach program. So either 7th and 8th graders would come to us and we'd do sort of a chem show or something like that, or we would go to their schools, and the lugging of equipment to a school sounds very familiar to me.
Absolutely, right. And in fact, that's what took me away from a pre-med route is into education, as this science outreach experience, and that I still to this day, refer to that as my roots in teaching as well. It's fascinating to see some of your rules here, and again, these are like suggestions for scientists working with science education, and they read a lot. In some ways, they almost feel like this could be a class for pre-service science teachers, because some of the things are also, they they parallel what a new science teacher might face, and more probably a secondary science teacher rather than an elementary science teacher. But it did strike me as, wow, these are things that some incoming science teachers might need to know. Have you had experience working with pre-service science teachers in that capacity?
No, I wouldn't say I have. I've done more professional development of teachers who are teaching now, but I think you're absolutely right. These are kind of the basic starting points, and everybody's kind of got to go through the basics. And the goal is to master the basics, not get too frustrated, not get too upset, but figure out how to move forward. And that's partly why I wrote that. I wanted people to have a good experience as they start to work in education and not make kind of rookie mistakes, if we can call them that.
What are some of those rookie mistakes that you've seen? And you do capitalize upon this in the article. Like, you talk a little bit about working from a deficit model, or coming in basically saying that, knowledge is more important than developmental learning kind of understanding, or coming in with a 50-point PowerPoint and wondering why the kids aren't engaged. Those are some things that really struck me. But again, these are things that some of our new teachers also need to know.
Well, absolutely. Those are things that will create problems. Sometimes people also go to great efforts to create new curriculum materials, even though they can't be used or they're not appropriate. But somebody thinks, I've got the perfect way to get kids excited about this topic, and they go to great effort to create something which might already be there or might have a better version out there. And again, maybe the issue is, how do you, even if you had it, what are you going to do with it? And why would the teacher want to use that? And is it even appropriate at that moment?
Let's talk a little bit about some of your rules here. One of the things that again, jumped out to me was being a guide on the side. And we talk about this in regular science education, the sage on the stage versus guide on the side. What do you think is an important piece or takeaway there that I guess scientists need to understand, but also science educators? I would argue that, again, some of these are good for practicing science teachers as well.
Right. The real point about guiding is a form of partnership, whether it's a partnership with the students, a partnership with your colleagues, a partnership between scientists and educators. How can you work together, respect each other, augment each other's skills, and reinforce each other? And that's very fundamental. It's not a solitary pursuit. It isn't that you stand back and solve the problem and go deliver the solution, but rather start to have a dialogue and a partnership to even understand what problem you're trying to solve, or what area you're trying to teach, or how best to teach it.
You touch on that, talking about what might be thought of as the deficit model in science, where a scientist might feel that it's natural to come in and find where a problem is, fix it, and filling in what might be a perceived gap. But you say it's a little bit, it's more than that. It's you don't just come in and fix the problem and move on.
That's right. The problem may be a bigger problem. It may be emblematic of other things. It may be more systemic. It may not be fixable. Most of these problems are not fixable. But the real point is to have some respect for the problem, to live with it, and to realize that the scientists or engineers' assessment of the problem may be completely incorrect. It may not be about what they think it's about. It may be about something completely different. So just looking at the fact that the kids don't seem to understand a concept and feeling like something's wrong, well, you can blame the teacher, you could blame the system, you could blame the students, but
blame last year's teacher.
Blame last year's teacher is a really good one. So this is what happens a lot.
Blame the parents.
That's what happens a lot for university people who go into schools. They already know that their students, maybe their first-year students or second-year students, don't seem to have a good grasp on this. So they look at it from the high school perspective. Something went wrong in high school. Maybe they want to go help fix that. But maybe that's not the right answer. Maybe it goes back further. Maybe their approach is completely inappropriate. And it also kind of puts a blame on others, and because they seem to know the topic, But I mean, the scientist knows the topic, but there may be many different reasons why that topic isn't so well understood by the students. So kind of solving a problem that isn't even understood is not very productive.
So basically being a little more empathetic about how that learning takes place.
Being empathetic and a little more respectful, because scientists and engineers are great at identifying problems, and they think they're great at problem solving, although systemic and larger problems sometimes are more difficult to solve. But just because you can see a deficiency doesn't mean that you have the answer to solving that deficiency.
Sure.
So how might a formal scientist or engineer avoid that when wanting to partner with a classroom or an informal science setting?
I think they have to be humble and realize that their assessment may not be correct. And in any case, maybe much more important is the assessment of the teacher when they start to talk about what they perceive as a problem. What is the real assessment? Is that a problem for the teacher? Are they worried about that? What do they want to do to solve it? How could the scientist help them address that problem if it's all agreed that that's something that is important and that the scientist has a role in helping? What can they do to really help the teacher through resources or through other ways to address the problem?
One of the pieces that rang true, and basically you talk about polite acceptance doesn't mean success, and you have a line that says many teachers will politely accept and perhaps even praise what is only incremental value to them. And I've seen this before. I've been part of this myself, where we have introduced and brought in outside people, and they are definitely valuable to being a participant, being a generous donor of their time, and maybe more than that. But it may not necessarily help advance basically our goals in the classroom that way. But of course, this is, it's important for scientists to recognize that. But I want you to talk a little bit about how we can avoid that in the science education setting as well. How can we not be as polite, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll have to think about that one. By the way, when we wrote that sentence, we actually had a much stronger version. We just kind of didn't want to offend everybody who was reading it, so we softened it up into that one.
Ooh, I could think of what that might be.
But I think the point is, I mean, this partly came out of sort of evaluations or teacher professional development workshops, where the people giving the workshop may or may not have given a great workshop, but ultimately when the feedback comes in, it's happy that they got something out of it, or happy that they were fed, or happy that some resources might be made available, or happy that they made some new contacts or met some new people. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the workshop was a big success or was delivered in the right way. Coming back to your question about science teachers, I think being more direct is a good thing. I think it's not very useful if you're getting something you really don't want. So the hope, of course, may be that the relationship can be furthered, and that there may be more resources available, or that it can grow with a deeper understanding of each other. But I think that demands sometimes just a level of outspokenness to say, you don't really appreciate what I'm doing, what I'm going through, and here you have your opinion, but here's the way I see it. So I think being honest is certainly being honest and direct, I think, is very, very helpful for furthering the relationship. But of course, that depends a lot on actually structuring the relationship, creating the right situation where the scientist and the teacher can get to know each other, trust each other, and start to have a more honest dialogue about what they can bring to the table.
It's interesting you say that. I think of situations in classrooms, and Dale and I work in the elementary setting a lot, and even in the high school, we are trained as educators to find ways to put positive, kind of uplifting messages to students, but also work in a way to push them forward as well. Compliment sandwiches, for instance, and other ways that we can kind of encourage them to better themselves, but always kind of in a motivational, positive way. At the same token, we definitely see very clear, we don't treat people that way, Dale. We don't, in some ways we almost need to bring those pieces out a little bit more when we're working with adults, perhaps.
I like how my friends over here are.
Yeah, exactly. So let's back up a step here. And we're talking about how to succeed with some of these partnerships and relationships, but how would we get started with that, if that's something that our listeners as science educators, whether that's in formal or informal science settings, how do we get started with that?
Well, I think we argue that there's two sort of different ways to approach this. One is a very ad hoc way where teachers can call up a scientist, or a scientist calls up a teacher or gets to know a teacher and starts to figure out what the relationship might be and how they can work together. Or they're contributing in some limited way, like judging a science fair or something like that. That's one way, and that can be very successful. But the other way is to actually create a program where you create the right opportunity, the right atmosphere, the right amount of time to help everybody work together. In astronomy, we have something called Project Astro, which is a teacher-scientist partnership. And the whole idea of it is to have a structured opportunity for people to get to know each other, be exposed to some new curriculum materials, learn a little bit more about the subject matter and about the education system, and then start to work together on an extended basis. So those kind of programs like Project Astro are very effective at creating the right atmosphere to engage quite a number of teachers with quite a number of scientists.
We have talked about that on the show before. There are certain organizations out there that are definitely lend themselves to kind of playing a matchmaker between the science community and education as well. Skype a Scientist comes to mind, and others we have talked about. And Dale and I have definitely practiced that over the last almost 2 decades, where we have found that just reaching out to scientists, many of them are very eager to work with the educational community, whether or not they can share their expertise, discuss about what they think is important for science education, and just simply thinking about ways to improve science education in the long run.
Exactly. I think the reaching out is really important, and especially if the teacher can reach out and describe what they really want on a larger basis, not just, I need a judge for the science fair, come at 3:00 and leave at 5, but rather created a more extended thing, whether it's I want to judge, I want you to get better at it and judge for the next 3 years, or whether it's we really want to meet and have a resource like you to help our science program. So if the expectations of the teacher are higher, then that relationship can start to become deeper. But if it's a very limited, find me some people from the science institution or from the university to do a specific task, well, that's fine, but that isn't always the right atmosphere. You're there, you learn how to judge, you do it, you get tired, you leave, and a year later it happens again. That isn't really going to aid the system very much.
You're almost suggesting that there should be an ongoing relationship rather than a kind of a one and done deal?
Absolutely, not just one and done or 5 and done, but a long-term relationship. It might be as a resource person, a resource agent who helps the teacher with concepts, or helps explain things, or helps them find resources on the web, or helps them find lab equipment. Doesn't necessarily have to be in direct contact with the students as a presenter. So I think this concept of scientists who could serve as resource agents is very powerful, because it doesn't presume that they know the educational system. It doesn't presume that they know pedagogical content knowledge. It doesn't presume anything about national standards. It just presumes that the teacher can use them on a regular basis to make requests of what they need, and they can reinforce the teacher's knowledge or help the teacher identify certain approaches, perhaps.
Do you talk about sort of the the treatment of experts. So if we call up a scientist, that the students can perceive that person's information that they're sharing as sort of absolute and final, and that we have to kind of be careful about that, because I think that's something that Brian and I have been discussing, that process of science. It's not, there are a lot of continuous things that are being done, and like something like even a textbook is almost too final and absolute for students. We have to kind of introduce that idea that this is, emerging information. Do you ever talk about that?
Yes, I think that's absolutely critical, that if a scientist is interacting with students, that they give the flavor of how science works, and not the rules of the game, not here's the steps of the scientific process, but rather point out to students that it works in a very informal way. It's more like, so-and-so came to my office and they asked me about this, and I told them to get lost, and then I thought about it a little harder and thought it might be an interesting idea, but I had one set of skills to offer, but we found somebody else who could do something else, but I didn't know how to do this, so we found somebody else who could do that, and then we started working on it, and then we came up with a crazy idea that nobody liked, but we started getting some data, and it seems to be working. So the process is very important, and that would, of course, then encompass the humility of science. It would encompass everything: the rigor of science, the humility of science, the setbacks, the human element, the teamwork, which is a huge part of science today, the teamwork involved. So it would highlight all the different aspects of science, and it wouldn't be about we made a hypothesis, we did this, we did that, because that isn't really the point. Science. I mean, the basics of science are there and have to be explained. It's evidence-based.
Sorry about that. My cats just knocked my coffee cup on the ground.
That stays in the show. What happened? A cat attack?
There was a clipboard with the papers that Stephen gave, and the coffee cup was on the side of it, and the cat stepped on the edge, which
no cats or Lego were damaged.
The coffee cup. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great metaphor for how science works, because sometimes things do crash.
Perfect.
I planned that. It was set up.
It's not an exact science.
Exactly. Okay, so you've talked a lot about maybe one scientist reaching out to a classroom, or a classroom reaching out to a scientist, and these kind of seem like ad hoc, maybe like partnerships or relationships that may not be systemic. You have a piece that's coming out soon that talks a little bit about educational stewardship and how science corporations, in a sense, or big science, can actually provide and support science education. First of all, like Dale and I are in Wisconsin, and so you talked a little bit about thinking about stewardship. Land ethic is something that is close and dear to us in Wisconsin with Aldo Leopold, and so that really sparked our interest there. Can you talk a little bit about what that might mean for educational stewardship and what that might look like?
Yeah, maybe we need a Sand County Almanac for education.
I like it.
I think the thought was there were two aspects to this. One was a sort of an ethical consideration that scientists have the skills. Scientific institutions are universities, research institutes. They're working together on big projects, but they have lots and lots of people who understand science, engineering, how science works. So at some level, if someone wants to say, well, the public doesn't understand science properly, or kids don't understand science properly, the responsibility might go back to the science institutions to really commit themselves to helping people understand how it all works. And so that's a sort of an ethical responsibility. But along those same lines is if you want to have a science literate society, and you want people to make evidence-based decisions based on scientific evidence, then the responsibility can go back to, in the same sense as land stewardship. It's like, what do we need to preserve that scientific society? And a big part of what we're arguing is that it's about the public schools. It's about a commitment to local public schools to be the steward of public education. because more and more of the emphasis is going towards the possibility of educating students privately, and that can weaken the public education system. So what do research organizations, what can they do to take responsibility for preserving what I think is one of the most important public institutions, our public school system?
Mm-hmm. I love that idea, and I think about, like, Dale and I are in Appleton, and Appleton was a big paper industry for a long time, and there was even the Institute of Paper Chemistry literally down the road from me. I'm looking out in my back, and there's an experimental forest that used to be in my backyard, essentially. And this was obviously an industry that employed scientists to work for them. How do we avoid an industry wanting to, I guess, selfishly gain from these partnerships, and maybe we're looking for interns or creating jobs or something like that? That's how do we make it just purely about the science instead of what are the benefits to me as a company or a corporation?
I don't think you could avoid the benefits to the company or corporation, and in fact that may be part of the reason they want to do that. I don't think I don't think it's an issue to avoid it. I think the issue is to keep that from being the primary motivator for doing it. So if they're doing it for PR purposes, or they're doing it to just get some, the scientific community does want more scientists, and they want well-trained scientists. That's going to always be there. And in fact, most organizations, including federally funded ones, have a fundamental responsibility to encourage the next generation of scientists. Our argument would be encourage them not just at the graduate level or the undergraduate level, encourage them all the way down to the preschool level. So take a broader perspective of how to encourage the next generation or the generation after that of scientists by going as far down into the system or identifying parts of the system that are really important to work with, like elementary and preschool. So I think that's it's important that organizations be honest about their motivation, and we've encouraged organizations to actually make some very specific commitments towards the stewardship of the educational system, and particularly the local education system.
What might those look like? Time, money, things like that?
Exactly. The idea is that they can actually. So that's coming back to this whole tension between ad hoc efforts, people who are interested in helping, perhaps helping their own children's schools or helping schools that are connected with an organization, versus a more fundamental concerted effort to help broader and larger groups of people. So one thing that could happen is to make a specific commitment. For example, if 3% of the money of a research organization went towards education, not communication, not press releases, not public relations, but actually towards educational efforts, then that would be a very firm number that you could decide whether they're doing it or not. And that would be very helpful to have that commitment, because that would now mean you have the money to hire people who have some expertise in science education, who can help coordinate programs with local schools and create these authentic partnerships that we've been talking about. So a definite monetary commitment can be very important to do that. The other aspect is to have a time commitment where employees could spend up to 5% of their time helping in science education. And that would be 5% to, so that basically means you get them, if you are one of those employees who wanted to do that, it's not for every employee, you could spend one day a month working in a school or at a school or with a school. And that's about the right amount to actually accomplish something. A smaller commitment on a more irregular basis won't do it. But that 5% wouldn't be towards helping your own child's school. It wouldn't be towards helping the school that's far away. It'd be helping a more local school that perhaps is located closer to the research center, and perhaps is not the school where the employees send their children. They might be sending them off to the suburbs, or if it's a rural research facility, they might not even be there that often.
Sure.
So that kind of commitment could lead to more employees getting involved in various ways, but would also lead to having the institution define what would be some good programs for those employees to work with the schools on.
I might add, too, that it would be important as a teacher with a cooperation like that it wouldn't just be necessarily with kids present, but also perhaps staff development days. This would be maybe a valuable opportunity to work with teachers to build curriculum or to think about ways that they can enhance that partnership where kids may not necessarily be present.
Yeah, it would also give the chance for professional development to be more professionally done. So instead of a more ad hoc effort of someone saying, I think these teachers need more about this topic, and then trying to design a workshop and trying to figure out how to get the people to come on the weekend to do that, it would lead towards a more professional approach of working with the school districts, helping create this professional development when the teachers can do it, and then creating a long-term support network for the professional development. So it would move it from, we were motivated to do something, we did it, now we're tired, we'll do it again sometime if we can find the energy to a more regular basis, which will help the teachers.
So basically getting rid of the chance in the whole process.
Getting rid of the chance and adding the professional element and the professional expertise, because the tenets of solid professional development are well known, but not well known by scientists.
Right.
What do you think prohibits that? I mean, maybe you can't speak to this, but I think of things that prohibit that being possible, and one is just turnover in schools. So to do what you're kind of saying requires sort of
finding continuity.
Yeah, the continuity of just employers that keep working in the district and kind of keep that plan going forward. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the continuity is a big deal, and that's what actually tends to sabotage these well-motivated but not so organized efforts. Is you had a great person you're working with and they left, or they changed subjects. You were working with them in astronomy, now they're teaching something else, and they're not really available to do what you were doing with them. So anything that can solidify the relationship, make it more accepted in the whole district sense of the word. Perhaps there's memorandums of understanding, but just putting it on a more professional basis, I think, could help it a lot.
I picked up a piece that you in that article that is not yet released yet that you shared with us, and something really stood out to me, and I'd like to share it here. Stewardship demands a commitment to preserving what is there, even if it has been degraded under the guise of educational reform or improvement. I think that probably, if you're still listening to us right now, that probably hits hard right now to some people, where we've seen science education perhaps degraded, maybe not, because there's been a lot of efforts to reinvigorate science education with the next generation science standards and going down to earlier levels too. I think some people are excited about doing science again, but we definitely have seen where educational reform or improvement has kind of like snubbed down what we thought was there, and stewardship could have a place to help revive that.
Absolutely. If a more concerted approach and more support for teachers was there, the opportunity to improve teaching, regardless of reform efforts or in spite of reform efforts. That was also a bit of I wasn't talking so much about reform efforts in the science area, but thinking of No Child Left Behind and some of the damage that was done in tremendous ways there. So.
Well, yes, and I was exactly thinking some of those same things. I was thinking about how maybe local systems might have certain policies. We've seen this in the middle school where in an effort to have a generalist working so they can teach math, science, and like English, for instance. They have removed a lot of science-trained teachers, and so they're not as competent or as confident in teaching science, and so that educational reform has degraded what I guess what we would call science education that we used to have.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to teach science through experiments and through inquiry activities, you need that comfort level, and that's what I fear is that we've lost that. We have a science interested child. They're not getting anything for a long, long time, and they're not really ever encountering somebody who has that scientific playfulness or that self-confidence to say a passion, self-confidence, wants to try the experiment, wants to play around, wants to investigate. They may not get that exposure to that person in their family. They may not get it through their neighbors. They may not get it through the school for a long, long time. And I guess that's the question is if you have a budding scientist, how long can they wait? Is fifth grade too late? Is seventh grade too late? Is 12th grade too late? I think we know the answer to that. The sooner the better, at least to get some inoculation that will stimulate the scientific thinking to see that that's how it works. That's what scientists do. That's what a scientist is. Exposure to somebody who's passionate about it is very important, and it doesn't have to be a scientist, but exposure to that passion is very critical to the development of future scientists, engineers, or just people who can embrace scientific thinking.
I'm also thinking that if you do have a strong advocate that has been cemented into a relationship within a school, it's a lot harder to mess with that, what is functioning already in science education. We sometimes see some changes that might be, again, educational reform, well-meaning, but the consequences are less science is taught. For instance, when we have tested math and ELA and not science to the extent that they are, less attention is given to science. And so if you have a strong partnership and advocate that can say, no, you can't do that, maybe you take that well-meaning politeness and turn it on its head. Like, understanding that educational systems are polite, if you have an advocate that says, no, don't do that, maybe we'll see less damage done.
And I think there's a parallel thing with research organizations as well, universities, national research organizations, federally funded research centers. If the educational mandate is not clearly defined, then, when the wind blows a different way, all of these organizations are stressed in their own way. They're all trying to provide scientific facilities, for example, to their users. They have a fundamental responsibility. For example, the observatory I worked with has a fundamental responsibility to keep the telescopes going with the best instruments so that astronomers from all over can come and do great research. So that's their fundamental responsibility. But if the educational responsibility or stewardship isn't well defined, then it's going to blow hot and cold. You may have one leader who thinks it's the greatest thing or wants to work with more graduate students, and you have another person who has a fundamental interest in younger children. So they will know that the educational system can benefit from that kind of work. So it can go back and forth, but we're arguing for the continuity. If the real devotion, it's really about money and time, right? So if the devotion of money and time is there, then the question is then how do you create good programs that are effective and that respond to the needs of your local community?
And without that definitely ties into how students view scientists and people who do research or work in science too. They're going to turn to pop culture references, stereotypes, images that lack diversity and those kinds of things, and then we're still stuck with students that can't connect to the work.
That's right. If they view science in that
white lab coat
way, white male lab coat way, then they're really getting a very distorted view of modern science and how it works. And as I said, the whole point about teamwork, that everybody has different skills and they work together for science, That's very different than the old style of the kind of individual genius who can do everything themselves and is very isolated. That isn't true at all. Science is an extremely collaborative enterprise, and the skill of cooperation is probably the most valuable skill for scientists today.
So maybe we should stop painting those heads on a wall in all the schools, where they just have floating heads of great scientists, painted on a mural on a high school.
I would agree with that. I think it'd be far better to get them exposed to some young scientists who can show them or take them into their lab or what they do and give them a sense of how science really works. And so then they can start. I'm all for doing science. If the students can do science and experience it for themselves, then they'll get a flavor for whether that's what they're interested in or if that resonates with them. But if it's all about just pigeonholing science into a set of rules, it's kind of like not being able to play a sport, but just spending all your years learning the rules, learning the details of the rules, learning the circumstances under which the rules are applied. That's not much fun. Just go play, and again, eventually you'll figure out the rules.
I guess if you
like
want
that
to
analogy.
Be an official, I guess. I don't know.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Stephen. This was a great conversation, and we're happy to see, we're encouraged to see that there are efforts from the science community to want to form partnerships with science education, both formally in public and private education, but also informally in museums and libraries and other areas where science is done.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.